All right. Thank you so much for coming on this Monday evening. I know it's a busy time in the semester, and we're really glad to have people show up for what we think is an incredible topic and an incredible speaker to have, a real expert on defense security. And someone who just this week has published a co-edited book on the intersection of climate change and security or insecurity. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But I wanted to just briefly introduce the event and what I am really excited about, our student discussant, Marian Moshammer, who is going to be joining us as well. So again, thank you for coming. I'm Liesl Hintz. I am an assistant professor of European and Eurasian Studies, normally based at the DC campus. But I've been here teaching two courses, one on Turkey and one on politics of protest. So I always believe that it is an appropriate and important time to be talking about Turkey. But of course, it is a particularly timely moment because it is the centennial of the Turkish Republic. We are celebrating the 100 years of the Turkish Republic. And of course, we are going to use that opportunity today to reflect on those 100 years. What are the challenges? What are the accomplishments? What are the main issues that we are talking about today at that centennial? So in order to do so, I'm very, very glad to say that we have Professor Ziya Meral with us, who, as I said, is an absolute expert on security, defense, foreign policy, particularly on Turkey and the Middle East, but also with a wider reach as well. He's an associate fellow of the Royal United Services Institute and a lecturer at SOAS in London. He's got lots and lots of credentials and assured me I didn't need to mention them all, but I'll mention a few. Visiting fellow at the Royal Navy Strategic Studies Center, senior associate fellow of the European Leadership Network, and related to the book project that I just mentioned, co-founder of Climate Change and Insecurity Project, which was part of the sort of network out of which this fantastic co-edited book called Climate Change, Conflict and Insecurity, Hot War just came out this week. So congratulations on that book. We're very excited. So if anyone is interested in the intersection of climate and defense and security, feel free to bring those questions as well. He's also the author of a book called How Violence Shapes Religion, Belief, and Conflict in Africa in the Middle East, and that came out from Cambridge University Press in 2018. So religion, conflict, identity, defense, foreign policy. As I like to say when it comes to Turkey, those of us who study Turkey are often looking at an intersection of a number of different events, a number of different topics, and he certainly is representative of that. So we're very, very glad to have you. Thank you so much. We also have, as I said, Marian Moshammer, who is a student in the class on Turkey conflicts and cultures that I teach. She will be our student discussant. She is a second-year MAIA student who did her first year in Vienna at the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna. She studied law at the University of Vienna. She has personal experience in national and international legal fields and has research interests in multilateral diplomacy with the EU and foreign policy in the Western Balkans, Latin America, and Turkey. So we're very glad to have you. I really like this model of the student discussant. So without further ado, we would like to invite Professor Ziya Meral to give our talk. We will then have some comments, we'll have some discussion, and then we will open it up for questions. So please have your questions at the ready. Please, thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll stand. And then I'll sit down for our discussions. And thank you so much for having me. I mean, it's always great to be back here. So when I got the email and they said, could you come to speak? Johns Hopkins I said, Bologna. I said, where's the question? Of course, I'm coming. Let's change everything in the schedule to make it happen. So what I really wanted to do for the next kind of like 20 minutes or so is to give you a broad set of remarks and some kind of conversation pointers so that hopefully we can unpack it together and discuss among ourselves, because approaching a country, putting it in a soundbite and coming up with like 3 bullet points and 5 kind of acronyms to communicate it all is a fool's errand. Why? Because you are looking at a complex society, a complex history, a complex politics, a complex region, and a complex global moment, which has an effect on how things develop and how things unfold. So that's why the simpler the explanation of Turkey is that you read, either through focusing on Erdogan or Neo-Ottomans, as I call it, the furniture company, you can bet it's leaving out a lot more than it's actually including in as an analysis. So approaching it is very difficult for that reason. But when you think about the 100th anniversary or the events that didn't happen for the last month that could have happened, or for the last few months, or that is unlikely to happen, and you start realizing how at the 100th anniversary of this young republic, relatively young republic, there is still at its core a search for a narrative, a vision that can bind it, that can guide its present and its future. And so much of the political fault lines that you see today, there's a continuum of it across Turkish history, which kind of asks the question of, so what is new exactly in Turkey? I mean, if you rewind the clock back at the very start of this young republic, in late 1800s and even early 1900s, the vision of the republic itself coming out of the collapse of an empire, envisioning what a Turk is and what a Turkish nation is and what are our borders, what is our identity, that whole process of envisioning a new journey, if you like, a new narrative, did have very similar contentions between those who believed in a more European-oriented republic, in a particular nation-state vision that was more secular. And I'm really wary of that term, and we can unpack that a bit more as well too, because that word means wildly different things depending on who you are in the audience. The American version versus the UK version versus the North European version of that word, or the South European version of that word, or Eastern European, are dramatically different in real life terms. Or those who believed in a vision of a republic that was more religious, more conservative, more traditional, and those that held a liberal vision of a republic that was, again, much more smaller state and more human rights and more progressive agendas. And it's interesting because there are scholarship, the historians that actually trace a lot of these debates back to the very founding of the Ottoman, collapse of the empire and emergence of the Turkish Republic, including the question of what do we do with minorities that are not going to define themselves as Turks, i.e. Kurds or those that are non-Muslims? How do you navigate that space of creating a homogenized nation state with an ideal type of a citizen, with a strong state that brings a collapsed empire together, and you're designing something, as Zygmunt Bauman says, where there is design, there's waste. When you are rebuilding a nation, you automatically create those contentions that do not fit in very neatly to the vision that you set. So fast forward 100 years, and all throughout it, and all throughout its domestic history, you are realizing that there's a continuum of the sacredness of the state in Turkish political and social and cultural positioning and relationship of it, the importance of that officially sanctioned version of the Turk, and who fits into that. Happy is the man who calls himself a Turk. Namutlu Türk'üm diyene is an aspiration that there is actually a definition within which you fit in. The state enables it. Its education, its use of religion is part of the same push to create a nation. So that's why Directorate for Religious Affairs in Turkey to this day, in fact, now more than ever, always had one of the highest budgets of a state across Turkish history, because the relationship to religion and identity was about forming a state that was based on its traditional values, a particular interpretation of Islam as an identity marker against all other groups and any vision that emerge. And again, dissent from it, minorities who don't want to necessarily fit into that type. Again, the question of Kurds, Kurdish rights, Kurdish language, Kurdish heritage, it's been there for 100 years as a contention at the heart of the Republic's journey. How do you create a space as a nation state for minorities that don't necessarily want to be in that archetype that you developed? And how do you position yourself in this narrative that is extremely difficult and complex? But the temptation, of course, in understanding Turkey is often pretty much trying to understand it merely internally and merely through its political actors, through its social and political fault lines. As years go by, I actually come to a much deeper appreciation of the external context that actually shapes Turkey, the external context that shapes political languages, aspirations in Turkey, social tensions, foreign policy decisions. In other words, Turkey doesn't really happen. It never really happened in a vacuum. A friend of mine managed to cut the map of Turkey with Adobe and then brought it next to Jamaica recently, and he sent it to him. He's like, look, I solved all the problems. Off we go to the Caribbeans. But there is a reality within which that actually a lot of these even domestic political political tensions and languages are affected by not just your immediate regional trends, but global trends too. The vision of a republic wasn't really an Ottoman legacy term that kept coming from across Central Asia as Turks marched and established the empire. It was a particular vocabulary, particular political structuring that came from Europe into the discourse, if you like. And it got internalized, it got changed, and it got adopted. And even if you look at the evolving aspect of political Islam across Turkish history, some of these vocabularies within political Islam that reflect 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s social and political and economic visions of the day. In fact, some of them read as socialist or communist manifestos or anti-imperial struggles, not necessarily a heritage that goes back 300, 400, 500 years ago to an imagined pure moment where Islam has lived among Turks. They are actually quite modern aspirations, quite modern political readings that impact and shape the way things are. 1979 revolution in Iran and its impact on political Islamic movements in Turkey. Cold War, its impact on left and right politics and positioning of Turkey in global fault lines. Those external developments did have a direct impact on it. And look at, for example, the Arab Spring. I'm putting it in brackets. I never liked that word, and I will die not liking that word. But the series of protests that we've seen that unfolded across Middle East and North Africa in 2011 onwards, or before that, war on terror era, the invasion of Iraq, all of these regional developments put Turkey into a particular trajectory, not just in terms of foreign policy response, but even in domestic politics. When the war in Syria unfolded the way that it did, and Turkey all of a sudden saw an influx of more than 5 million new people entering into its country, therefore, that development on your border isn't simply about a foreign policy question. It is directly impacting you. So we spend a lot more time thinking about how Turkey impacted Syrian war. We didn't spend that much time on how Syrian war has actually impacted Turkey socially, economically, politically, and for many years to come, even religiously, even demographically. How is this actually going to evolve? How is this going to change how we understand Turkey for so many reasons? Yes, maybe Prisoners of Geography, the title of a book by my friend Tim Marshall, a great book. Maybe it's a bit more complicated. Maybe we're not prisoners. Maybe that's a bit of a stronger assertion, but geography does matter, right? Those developments around you, the seas around you, the climate around you, political possibilities around you do impact. And again, Arab Spring, if you look at how reading of Arab Spring in Turkey has evolved as it unfolded with the protests, but even anxieties it gave in Turkey. So when the ousting of President Morsi in Egypt happened, you could see the parallels that were being drawn in Turkey among conservative Turks, or the same plot line of a military-backed government forcing out religious conservatives, putting them in prison and sending them to that sentence, how it actually ended up becoming a parallel anxiety and tension again in Turkey because of its own history, because what happens out there tends to be impacted and internalized within. But if you step back from those regional developments, there is the question of current global context. Again, we're not in a new Cold War. And again, I hate when people jazz up those kind of old languages. The world is not divided along those two ideological camps with an iron curtain. And there is something called third world out there. But what you are witnessing at a global level is two major powers, i.e. US and China, clearly seeing each other in systematic competition terms, both as a threat and challenger, with a huge effect in global geopolitical, economic, social, defense, security lines. But what is really more fascinating isn't that you have two big powers eyeing each other as a competitor. Middle powers in today's global scene are playing a lot bigger role than we assumed that they did in these kind of big groupings they hedge under. They are much more willing to pursue strategic independence. They're much more willing to be assertive for their interests. And they internalize the fact that today's global geopolitical competition is both a huge threat for them. They can't really rely on traditional allies. As such, they have to form multiple alliances, diversify their interests. They have to balance their needs, but also when the time comes, they must not shy away from posturing themselves in a defense term, because the era of soft power, the era of soft diplomacy, UN Security Council, international law and regulations has gone out of the window, right, at the moment. I don't know who killed it first. You could go back to, obviously, invasion of Ukraine is the most immediate one that we see. You could rewind the clock back maybe to 2008, Georgia as a sign, maybe, or maybe Obama's disastrous red line over Syria when we failed to protect and what was happening, and that unleashed a lot of other problems in the Middle East, or maybe the invasion of Iraq in 2003. You can rewind the clock, and I don't know how far we will go, but there's been a murder, there's a dead body on the road, and that is the fact that today's countries in the region, particularly where Turkey is, look at the global affairs and do not see any other chance but to posture themselves in defense and security capabilities and assert themselves. You look at how Saudi Arabia is engaging with US, but also with China for the first time, even talking to Iran directly, but is also not shying away from use of force against all other traditional kind of pressures that it managed to. And that is very similar to Turkey, that external context of those regional alliances, countries that are asserting itself, has actually put Turkey into the same trajectory of investing into its defense capabilities, investing into its muscles. And obviously, when you have a hammer, a lot of the problems start looking like a nail. So then if you can fly a drone over something, why wouldn't you? To basically, now it's more expensive to fly F-16s over the Aegean and get into the usual Greek-Turkish tensions. Now you can actually have drones to do that. But you realize even questions over Cyprus, how things have evolved. It is no longer the traditional perspective, or since AKP came into power, there were genuinely belief and desire on their part to solve this, to unite the island, to move on as part of EU and as part of other things they wanted to. Fast forward 20 years, at the moment, the geopolitical context itself first doesn't make that a desirable path to follow. B, it's not going to happen. All the other moments when actually it could have happened has already gone away. And you're realizing now the Cyprus issue is no longer actually about a UN-led talk, which is really futile from now on to repeat, but we will repeat it again because we love the idea of those talks, even though they don't go anywhere. So you realize you're looking at a Turkey at the moment where sees the world from a very peculiar perspective. The world is changing, alliances are changing. I'm a NATO member state, but I also have to work with Russia. Yes, US is too important to completely walk away from. You cannot, but you're also not too happy, and you will also reach out to China. But you also know there's probably one country where you could count as an ally, even though that has a lot of limits and traditionally has actually been very limited beyond romanticism, and that's Azerbaijan, right? And that has been more cultural, romantic approach of two people, no, two nations, one people. But Erdogan actually didn't really have an Azerbaijan or Caucasus focus for 15 years. And strategically, it wasn't really necessarily his focus and for various stages, and we can maybe discuss that as well too. So if you look at today's Turkey, both from a foreign policy perspective and both from a kind of domestic political perspective, I think I see only one word that kind of captures what you're witnessing, which is contention. So I see three contention areas that are shaping today's Turkey. And I think those are what will actually shape Turkey for the next 2-3 decades. First one is there is a contention that lies at the heart of Turkey's position in the world today. And this isn't necessarily about Turkey itself, right? So I'm not here talking about Erdogan again, but I'm talking about the very external dynamics which Turkey finds itself in. So EU membership has died a long time ago, right? So it's not going to happen. Alliance with Russia is not really an alliance. So anybody who wrote an article that talked about bromance between Putin and Erdogan, you know, please never read them again. It was a gimmick. And you realize that relationship is actually competition, compartmentalization, a very fierce dynamic where we need to work together, but we're also competing, and sometimes we're killing each other, people, but we'll manage and we'll give it a picture together. It's a very complex thing, which I could never do. I don't have that mental furniture to pull such a complexity. And you realize down south, you know, when people say Turkey is turning away from the West, another really futile line of argument. Don't read any articles that talk about that too from now on. There is no east to turn to, right? And also there is no west that Turkey was fully in that is kind of turning away from. With NATO, it's a much more a la carte relationship. than it has been. For most NATO states, it's the same thing. They choose and pick when they want to jump into certain things and when they duck down and when they simply keep quiet and they hope US pays for it and sends the soldiers. Turkey isn't really exceptional about trying to get compromises from a new member. Greece did that for North Macedonia for a decade before the country changed its name. So a lot of these NATO contentions are not necessarily new, but at the same time, it is true. You are seeing a Turkey that is in NATO, but isn't necessarily too much in tune with some of the major countries in North America and Europe that shape certain policies and focus, i.e. United States, i.e. France, and i.e. Germany. That is not there. But Turkey also doesn't have any other way of balancing those relationships. It needs to work with the Gulf countries. It's easing at the moment, even with Egypt, which was a huge point of contention, and is trying to create itself a space to balance a very complex global geopolitical and economic space. So there was the first contention that lie at the heart of Turkish position within these global and geopolitical developments. And then second is the contention at the heart of its foreign policy. There is a contention within Turkish foreign policy where you're able to see in certain moments, in certain portfolios, a very strong realism-driven calculation of what is in the interest of Turkey, what are threats to Turkey, how do we basically maximize our interest, minimize the damage that can come, pursue economic opportunities, pursue energy resources and energy policy of being a transitory hub, and negotiate with everybody, support Ukraine, because actually we don't like what Russia is doing, but also don't burn all your bridges with Russia, also make some money on the side as well. It's never a bad idea. That's really a coherent, if you like, rational foreign policy approach. You know, there's enough literature on it. That's not really magical on its own. It's not about East and West and Erdogan sitting on a chair with a white cat thinking about how can I make it difficult for the West. It is actually a very rational case of a middle power trying to maximize its interests from a perspective of reading a region that is in chaos and in wars and conflicts. It needs to assert itself. But at the same time, when you have that rational framework, you also have a very personalized now decision-making process and policy execution and a domestic political context that poses a discontinuity. So while, for example, Turkey obviously normalizes with Israel, we've been here, I think, 4 or 5 times already last 20 years, because from a pure rational, realistic perspective, realism perspective, this is in Turkey's interest to do, is with Egypt, is with Israel, is with everybody. And then an incident happens like Mavi Marmara Flotilla or the current developments in Gaza, or Netanyahu says something, he says something, and there is a genuine concern for Palestinians amplified with all these regional developments. And you see that rational realism suspended, or even in the Gulf crisis, for example, or in the Arab Spring, where Turkey was almost being forced to take side. Are you going to be with Qatar or actually with Saudi Arabia and UAE? And Turkey didn't want to, but they had that personal relationship with Qatar, and they had that overall engagement with Muslim Brotherhood groups in the Middle East that again put them into a very difficult spot because there's all sorts of entanglements. And then President Erdogan makes a comment and it becomes a whole foreign policy contention. So you're realizing how on one hand, you have a state that can actually read, interpret, perform in a rationality of its own, pursuing strategic independence, which we can read externally and say, this is therefore how you respond to it. And then there are all these moments which are a bit more dramatic, a bit more personal, a bit more inconsistent, and it creates a contention, continual friction at the heart of it. What is leading Turkish foreign policy and how is it going to unfold? Therefore becomes this contention. And the other contention, I think, lies at the heart of its domestic conditions, which hasn't been solved. I think for the last 100 years, you are looking at the contention between more religiously conservative Turks on one hand, and more religiously less conservative, but politically very conservative Turks on the other hand, and nationalism uniting them all. And on the other hand, you have the layer of actually minorities, dominantly Kurds, wanting to have their own political and social vision. Most I say elusive vocabulary, but a particular aspect of Kurdish politics that is about independence, that is about self-determination. And it creates this contention at the very heart of the Turkish society, Whose country is that? Who represents the norm? Who monopolizes the center stage? Who monopolizes culture, economy, and the state structure? Who is the Turk, if you like, that embodies Turkishness? And that contention, I think, hasn't been solved. And said the Turkish politics keeps lapsing back to culture wars, identity wars, that keeps fragmenting it, rather than actually a Turkish politic emerging that could say, well, 21st century has arrived. Here's our citizens, here's our state, here are citizens, here are the massive global developments. How do you envision their security, stability, and welfare come together, work together, put forward a new vision for the next 100 years of the Republic, unite everybody, focus on your economy, ease your foreign relations? That's not what you have seen in the last elections, right? So what you have seen in the last election wasn't from anybody a coherent vision for a new republic ahead of us that moves on from the failures of the last. It was, again, entrenchment on the same political, cultural fault lines that actually works, numerically works in any electoral season, and that has always worked for President Erdogan's benefits. And now he wants to change the constitution to lower the threshold to remain as a president, because there's a limit to that too. So questions ahead, really, just some thoughts maybe we can discuss, or things that I reflect when I go back and forward to Turkey or observe things. I think one key question ahead for me is how much the Turkish state structures have changed with the new presidential system. It's been phenomenal to observe. It's been very quiet, but substantial and fundamental. What is that going to mean in the future, right? You know, if you remember, there was a time everything else you read on Turkey was, is Turkey becoming Iran? And then was Turkey becoming Malaysia? Was Turkey becoming Indonesia? Was a bit common. Once I wrote an article just for a laugh saying, is Turkey becoming like USA? And my comment was like, this Republican democratic culture wars, you have two options and symbolic identity issues. That was a tongue-in-cheek article just to get people angry at me. But we didn't think about much about would Turkey become China, in the sense that a strong state based on a single party, a long-term president, technocratic structures, different groupings. And that's a really fascinating to think about. What is the future of the Turkish state? Beyond Erdogan, especially, because a lot of it at the moment is based on his political appeal and power. What happens after Erdogan? How is this going to hold together? How is this going to perform together? All these fault lines within bureaucracy, all these decision processes, and the influence you need to take that decision in Ankara all the way down to execution. Trust me, no state works magically, like somebody signs something and things happen. So much work goes in from that to the execution. So how is that going to work? What is the future of the Turkish state formation? That, to me, I think is going to be a very fascinating thing to pay attention. And the other one is the political balance. Again, I already hinted a bit at that. Is this going to be a single state party political space? Or is it going to see more fragmentation because of the last electoral patterns, that actually it might be more and more difficult from now on for another single party to emerge, for another single leader like President Erdogan to emerge, particularly after him? Then if that's fragmentation, are we going back to Turkish politics a la late 1990s, early 2000s, fragmented small coalition figures, or maybe not, or maybe do they manage to transition right? And then actually Erdogan's legacy remains as a strong state, a strong party, a strong leader. And how would that work? And what kind of political culture context that would create? And then the social fault lines, those that are based on ethnic differences or lifestyle differences, as we spoke. And then the question of migration into Turkey. So I already hinted at, more than 5 million Syrians. That's a lot of intake in terms of your social fabric. And a lot of those Syrians rightfully don't want to go back, and more are born. Some are Turkish citizens, some are not. And language skills are amazing. They're contributing a lot. They're working. And they are actually, they're really integrating. In some places, some other groups are in some issues in some cities, and it's becoming a political issue. Seen in the last election, our Turkish nationalists, as well as our Turkish Republican friends, have made the Syrians a rally cry. Kılıçdaroğlu promised to send them all back if you had voted for him, which is interesting. President Erdogan, whom we see more authoritarian, had more nuanced arguments about why you can't do that and why actually. But that also goes through his own vision for the society and the relationship. That's also a very fascinating dynamic, why he's a lot more accommodating on migration than other European leaders or other leaders around the world. And then foreign policy question. How is Turkey going to steer through the new Middle East that has been unleashed? We had a particular trajectory in mind before 7th October attack. Now we can't really see where this is going. We are not really certain of where the US-China buildup is going. We're not really certain of so many of these regional developments and actors and their agendas. How is Turkey going to steer? Because obviously it's not going to be part of any clear bloc. It's not going to be an EU state. Turkey is going to be a NATO member state, but not fully agreeing with on everything, led by North Europe and North America. How is Turkey going to navigate this? That's a very difficult portfolio, and they genuinely have my every sympathy. It's really not easy to develop and respond and run those things. And I think if you think about Turkey 10, 20, 30 years from now, strangely, I'm actually optimistic. One of the last men standing. I do think Turkish economy next 5-6 years is bound to be really precarious as it is. But I think it could rebound a lot more surprisingly than also people give credit to for so many other structural reasons. And actually that might again show a Turkey that is economically doing better. That might again show a Turkey that feels more confident in a way that doesn't necessarily want to pick fights, but actually wants to again invest into the same energy. But I think socially, the human fabric, the human potential is to me one of the most impressive things about Turkey. Its dynamism, its culture. Maybe another politic might emerge. Maybe this too shall pass. Maybe this political generation too had their say, actually. Maybe you are looking at the last few pages of this era. And maybe this new generation of Turks, which I've been out of Turkey 25 plus years or so, but the number of highly educated, connected, of all walks, Turks that I know that have left Turkey, that are leaving Turkey for the last 5-6 years is unprecedented in number. But I'm not the kind of guy who believes in brain drain. I'm the kind of guy who believes in actually a lot of flower pots being taken to bigger pots and growing, and in this global connection having a huge impact back to where they first emerged from. That's going to have a big impact on Turkey. I do think a new politic, a new dynamic is very well within our reach. But I don't think next 10 years is going to be easy domestically. I think there's going to be a lot more instability, a lot more concerns on human rights, democracy, and economic vulnerabilities. But weirdly, at the end of it, I do feel a better future is possible, as it said in the Golden Marriott Hotel. What was that quote? It will all work out well in the end, and if it hasn't, it's not the end.
Thank you so much for that. I think it gives us a tremendous amount to think about. And I have to say, I genuinely appreciate the bringing of the optimistic aspect. I think I sometimes perhaps bring a little bit more of a pessimistic aspect. I worry about brain drain. I worry about youth not having employment opportunities. I worry a lot about that. We can perhaps talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A. But I just want to reflect, I think, on how well this sort of complicates the binaries that we think of when it comes to Turkey, but in a really, I think, cohesive and comprehensible way. One of the things that your talk really brings up for me that I think is so important is the sense that, Turkey's domestic politics and foreign policy doesn't develop in a vacuum. Of course, we know this intellectually, but to think about the many ways in which the geopolitical context has so fundamentally shaped the trajectory that Turkey has been on over the past 100 years. And you mentioned, obviously, the Arab uprisings. You mentioned October 7th. The sense that there was a course that the government was trying to follow. It had plans, it had intentions, and then those just kind of get blown up in their face when they've, tried to play a mediator role, or they've tried to normalize relations for energy reasons. And then that's going to kind of become complicated. I think the Erdogan government is often thought of as a sort of very well-skilled machine in turning a crisis into an opportunity. And I think they did so with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think they're really struggling now to figure out what to do and how to position themselves. And their overtures of trying to be a mediator in the current events with Israel Hamas are sort of falling on deaf ears, and Qatar is playing a bit more of a impressive role there. But again, this idea of the geopolitical context shaping domestic and foreign policy, you gave so many examples, and you said you can kind of keep rewinding the clock back. And the one that strikes me so much is the first Gulf War, in fact, and the effects on the Kurdish issue and the way that Operation Provide Comfort and then the development of the KRG kind of makes Turkey much more concerned about the potential for the Kurdish movement to become much more active in Turkey. So I think, again, that geopolitical context is really quite important, and we can look at a number of inflection points there. I really appreciate also the discussion of middle powers and the ways in which they are finding strategic autonomy through strategies that don't necessarily make sense. You're a NATO power, but you're buying a missile defense system from Russia, and you get really angry when the US says that you can't. And then you're using this kind of very counter-hegemonic narrative against the US, which is both rational and identity-based. So I really appreciated you showing how there are pragmatic reasons for why the state is pursuing the foreign policies that it is. But of course, these also have underlying identity dynamics that can, again, sort of complicate things when you have something like an October 7th. So I really appreciated the geopolitical context, the role of the middle powers, and so forth. And then sort of this sense of the ways in which the institutional context shapes foreign policy making, I think is really important. And so I'm going to turn this into a question back to you, which is to kind of think about the evolving role of the military and civil military relations. If we look back over the 100 years of the Turkish Republic's history, massive changes in the role of civil military relations, from a power that was consistently intervening for various reasons. I think a lot of people think it's only about secularism. It was about political violence. It was about economic crisis. The military posing a threat potentially to the AKP and Erdogan, its role having changed over time, potentially being emboldened after the coup attempt in 2016. So I'd love to kind of get your sense of where you see the military now as a political player. How much influence do they have? How is the AKP/MHP electoral alliance constrained by them? Where would you kind of put the role of the military now in terms of its role as a political actor?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really easy question to start with. I really appreciate that. Look, I think, you perfectly put it already. I think you have witnessed an evolving relationship there. In other words, where you have seen the Turkish military's role as the guarantor of the state and the legacy of Atatürk, which is an interpretive scheme, right? So it's not, Atatürk might have actually surprised us today. And I often think about it. You remember people used to wear bracelets like WWJD, what would Jesus do? I always want to do like, what would Atatürk do kind of race, to basically kind of think about, wow, gosh, if Atatürk was alive today, how would his politic look like? I genuinely get a kick out of thinking about what ideas would he be incorporating? What kind of a state would he be envisioning? So to an extent, the 1980s Turkish military, or 60s and 70s, 2000s, or the postmodern coup, to what extent that reflects actually, a legacy of Atatürk versus power versus who actually is going to call the shots, that's, to me, is still up for grabs. But obviously after the coup attempt, you have seen two things. One, I do think that night, that disastrous coup attempt was stopped, because the Turkish public stood up, and and that's wonderful. But I think Turkish military also in substantial numbers stood against it. That to me was a breaking point. If they hadn't, it could have really broken down the state. It could have broken down Turkey. And by doing it, I think they both opened the door for a new relationship that emerged, a synergy between the government and the military. And that's the role of the defense minister, Akar, also, who was the chief of the general staff during the coup. That enabled that reform process, and Turkish military did need reform, militarily as well as politically and socially. Some of it is very difficult to pin down externally. Some of it we can trace it. Some of it is actually really modernizing Turkish military, and that's really welcomed by everybody, including in the defense industry, the role of civilian partners in that, which again reflects the kind of global movement impacting Turkey too. But the other aspect of it is I think there is, because of the coup attempt, there was already that recognition, this desire to shape the politics has gone too far. Things have to change, and now reform is coming. But the biggest thing I think on the table is Syria and the region. What I mean by that is, again, an example of how external developments impacted Turkey. If you remember, right before Syrian civil war and Assad Jr.'s decision to follow what Assad Sr. did, which is to pull out of certain areas and enable PKK to attack Turkey or to emerge there, which then gets Turkey focused on them rather than on you. Genius of Assad, just like his father. By doing that, you've seen how the potential for peace in Turkey, peace process also crumbled. We had PKK fighters coming down the mountains, Nehru statements being read. And then from there, we went to messaging from Kandil saying, well, the era is over, we're pursuing revolution. And Erdogan, and didn't also, Kurdish votes were also going, events happened in Kobane, which changed the trajectory. Bombs exploded in Turkey, half of them clearly from Syrian intelligence. So you realize how that whole kind of trajectory also affected the Turkish state's perception of, we are facing a new threat and this is unprecedented. And it is true, it is unprecedented. This wasn't 1970s, 80s, 90s fight against PKK. And that also meant that Turkish military and defense had that central role, again, actually in response to it. So if you look at militarily, operationally, what has happened, they are very much there. They are very much influential. But the other entity that wasn't this visible and influential is MIT, the Turkish intelligence, which traditionally wasn't really a large entity, didn't have this kind of more, a complexity of signals intelligence, human intelligence, paramilitary structures, capacity to be able to work with partners on the ground in a larger scale and fight wars, operate drones. These are very much CIA tools, which then they adopted and evolved under Hakan Fidan. The budget has rocketed, capabilities have bucketed, but also use of Turkish intelligence as a diplomatic conversation channel, which is again very much in line with the US model, has actually evolved that space. So when you look at the National Security Secretariat, their decisions, it really isn't anymore merely a meeting where military might tell off a government or they might discuss appointments. It is operational, it is actually political, intelligence, foreign policy, and defense. A lot of that is good, right? A lot of that is genuinely good. But of course, with any post-coup restructuring, there was the question of who's being promoted, who's being taken in. Again, that kind of social engineering question of, are these all, being promoted because they're not going to cause a problem, or they're because the best soldiers? Again, who is a Gülenist, who is not? I think that era damaged a lot of people, particularly for Turkish military officers who got branded to be a Gülenist, and then 2 years later, actually, no, you're not. You can come back and you're promoted. That, I think, caused a lot of pain and damage and a lot of mistrust and a lot of fear among them. And I think a part of it might still be there, that actually still, I think today, Turkish military personnel might be feeling really cautious about what they do, what they say, lest somebody accuses them of being a Gülenist or somebody. And that's damaging in the long run. So where we are now, perhaps in some aspects, a maturation of that social, military, political, military conversation and other entities in the room that shapes Turkish defense and security responses. Some of it is trust regained to work together. Erdogan has been good for Turkish military. If you look at all the investment and everything, some of it is also mistrust, i.e. fear and anxiety. So that's why it's quite difficult at the moment to capture a clear, neat framework of where is the Turkish military in the middle of all of this.
I think that's precisely the correct answer. I think any kind of clear, definitive.
20 minutes to give that
No,
answer.
but any kind of, I think, binary assessment of it misses the complexity. And I think that's what you did so well in your talk is that these complexities, often we brush over them, but they explain so much. And when we do take the time to understand them, I think they help us kind of see what the range of possibilities are, not which is going to happen next, but what the range of possibilities are and what might follow if one thing happens, because there's so many contingencies in terms of what might happen. And I would definitely agree that I think Erdogan has been good for the military in this round. And I think that's partially because he, potentially still fears the military or wanted to make sure that it is content and has an organizational identity. And I think the development of the domestic defense industry is good for the economy. I think it's good for strategic independence. I think it's good for separating from the US, but I think it's also good for the military itself in terms of a potential veto player. So again, excellent, fantastic response to that, which I think is a really important question. So I want to turn it over to Marion for a few questions. So what do you bring to the table, Marion? What would you like to ask the experts?
I have so many questions.
Who killed John F. Kennedy? That, I watched the documentary. I don't know.
I would like to start with a question that refers to a phrase that you used before, which was that Turkey can be referred to as a prisoner of geography. I would like to flip the coin and turn this into the context of energy. What do you currently see as challenges in the Turkish energy landscape? And on the other hand, how do you see possibilities for Turkey within this energy context, but in a more, let's say, geopolitical sense, especially relations to Central Asia, to Russia, to the Caucasus region, versus the West on the other side?
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I'm not an energy specialist, so my comments are more broadly geopolitical sense. But as you already hinted, I mean, there is a physical aspect to being a state, which is it shapes your possibilities. It shapes your trade possibility. It shapes, like when, for example, UK decided to leave EU, and as a British Turk, it was a really funny moment because I was giving a talk in Brussels at the EU Commission, and I said, look, as a British Turk, this is a really awkward conversation. Half of me wants to leave, the other one wants to stay, wants to come in. I don't know which side I'm going to talk today. But there is an element where, like, even for the UK, for example, even though you're coming out of EU, you still have to trade with EU. And, when people were talking about, oh, we'll increase trade with New Zealand and Australia, I'm like, oh, good luck. I mean, there is an aspect of trade that is immediate. I mean, this is the bulk of your trade, is this neighborhood. And for Turkey, too, there are all these geographies where it has to trade with, it has to buy, it has to maximize, it has to exchange. It can't have the luxury of not. Turkey-Iran relations, for example, we don't talk much about them. It's a phenomenal story of contention, anger, easing, a bit of a friendship, opportunity. We could work together, contention, animosity, easing, friendship, or we could work together, contention. That you could probably do 20 cycles of that over the last 50 since the revolution, both for Erdogan and even for predecessors of Erdogan too, in power. But again, energy was a core aspect of we need to buy Iranian energy, which turns out to be unreliable in its volume, which turns out to be expensive, and it makes Turkey vulnerable. So there was the question of Russia. There's question of buying liquid gas, even Qatar supplies and others, and diversifying, but not only just diversifying for own Turkish domestic context, but as a desire to be an energy transitory hub. It is a bit tricky because energy transition hubs, don't make the biggest killing in energy trade, as I understand it. If you have a pipe going through your back garden, don't get too excited. They don't pay you that much. But the vision is both for Turkish diversification, political influence this gives in all these partnering states and related industries, that you're looking at a package. If you could then work with Egypt, Israel, and even with Cyprus, I genuinely think one of the desires of Ankara is to say, if there is energy, let's find it together and let it come up this way, which actually makes a lot of sense, by the way, practically. But we're hot-blooded Mediterraneans, that's too rational. And let's find a way, basically, to make it for everybody. And you can see that logic to be wanting to keep energy out of everything. Even with KRG, they were more than happy to buy direct from them, but Baghdad wasn't. And then it's been this kind of negotiation. Again, with Israel, I mean, trade between Israel and Turkey hasn't stopped, by the way. And even President Erdogan, I think last or the week ago, I said, oh, but we still have to, as a state and do it and etc. So you realize those needs any country has, which is your energy, your desire to increase trade volume, is there. And now with the developments in Karabakh, with Azerbaijan, Armenia, some of the kind of proposals I've seen coming from Armenia, even, in Turkey and other kind of hopeful places, is there a way of turning this tragedy upside down and basically opening new borders across the region and new trade routes and new energy routes? And yes, it is horribly painful and it looks impossible to rewind the clock. But at the same time, there could actually be a new, very surprising series of things ahead of us. That would be exciting. And then bring that into Belt and Road Initiative with China, right? So you're looking at $1 trillion invested all across on all the trade routes. And that also explains why President Erdogan has gone horribly quiet about the Uyghurs, right? If you remember, he's went to Xinjiang, which I was like, wow, you're really going to do that? I mean, that takes diplomatic balls, if that's the academic way of saying it. In other words, to say to China, by the way, before I come to Beijing, I will love to stop in Xinjiang, which is what he did. That takes a lot of courage. And, and I really respected that. And he did, by the way, get it. But he was quite frustrated that they drew his car in particular roads and everything he did was choreographed, of course. But, and a lot of Uyghur opposition groups were hosted in Turkey, and there have been some deportations, there have been some sad reports, and Erdogan has gone quite understandably because of economic questions and geopolitical questions. So you realize how that geography, and I don't necessarily think Turkey is a prisoner of geography. That's why I said, my friend's Tim Marshall's book is a good one. Maybe prisoner is a bit of an intense word, but geography, as in Turkey, they say coğrafya kaderdir. Geography is destiny, or fate or destiny. I smile about it, but every now and then I think, okay, so if we take a Northern European approach to that statement, we can change our destiny. If we take a Middle Eastern attitude towards it, well, inshallah, so I don't know where this is going to go. Maybe if God is willing, maybe. And if you take an Asian response to it, well, we've had a lot of bad karma to pay. That's not going to change, really.
All right, maybe Marian, one more question. Then we've got one that's up in the Q&A. So if you're joining online, please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A, and then we'll also take some from the audience as well. So maybe one more to follow up.
Maybe a bit of a different topic, but related to what you just said. You touched upon the EU and the Turkish relations with the EU. I was wondering, how do you see climate change and migration affecting this relationship, especially since 2016? And then maybe in a bigger picture, how do you see Turkey positioning itself between Western or the West and the East, say, also organizations such as NATO in the West, and then the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in the East?
Yeah. Look, again, really easy questions. Thank you so much. Very helpful. But I do have a free dinner tonight, so you're more than happy to.
Earn your dinner.
Yeah. But look, first of all, the EU conversation, I do think, so the accession has been that for a very long time. And for various reasons. One, Turkey lapsed from the criteria of the reform. Agreed. But half of Europe actually never really made up its mind about Turkey coming into Europe anyway. Negotiation chapters have been blocked. Certain countries like Austria and others had a very clear policy from day one, even Germany. This is really not going to happen, right? But the process had value. And once Cyprus joined into EU, without actually solving the question of Ireland as part of that package, I actually said, this is the day we killed two birds with one stone. The bird of uniting this island is dead. The bird of Turkey entering into EU is dead. To me, personally, that was one of the biggest strategic failures of Europe that could have turned around both Cyprus and its relations with Turkey and have tremendous impact on Turkey. Even though accession talk could have gone 10, 20 years, that could have opened the floodgates of so much reform, integration, engagement, where we could have said, not yet, but somewhere beyond the rainbow, there is a possibility. But I think a long time ago, that possibility died, and the carrots and the sticks and the appeal of accession process also died. I mean, EU really makes it very clear by not including Turkey in particular statements about new members, and that actually you're not. And Erdogan also doesn't shy away from raising points. And we did have a last Turkish foreign minister was very polemical, which really didn't help. Current one is more quiet and more kind of doer, so that helps a lot in diplomatic terms. So, but everybody knows, as Leonard Cohen says, everybody knows the deal is rotten. Old Joe is still picking cotton. So the EU conversation has died. The process has no value, but there is strategic fatigue in Europe towards Turkey, and that is deadly. That is driven by both their own domestic political attitudes towards Turkey or their own chaos domestically. That is also partially driven by Ankara's competitive and argumentative and at times highly contentious conversations. But that is also about, again, global context. But there is genuinely a strategic fatigue, and that's deadly. And that's so then when a crisis pops up, then all that is left is people like President Macron to just go and, just say a harsh statement and thinking that will change anything. It doesn't. You need a long-term strategy towards Turkey as Europe. At the moment, nobody's formulating it. Is it a new customs union? Half of the Europe, again, will see that as rewarding Erdogan, which I think to be a really silly argument. If you want to draw this country closer, have influence, have channels, you have to. It's good for you for trade. It's actually good for you in all those portfolios. But even in Syrian war, even in migration issues, there's been a lot of moments where Turkey was not allowed to be in the room because other European EU members didn't want it. So again, the question of EU states agreeing on every policy to be able to do certain things also needs to evolve if Turkey is to have a space. So sadly, I'm not optimistic about, at the moment, any new trajectory that we could grant Turkish relations with EU beyond accession. I think we need to stop that charade and we need to reimagine. So that's why then you can understand how, from Turkey's perspective, they know, like, this isn't happening. But that process should remain, and that's what EU also prefers. Nobody wants to be the one to call off the relationship, but they changed their Facebook status a long time ago. But we're still friends. We're still not like Taylor Swift level, or we're never getting back together. We're still not there. And then you got all these other complex relationships where NATO, Turkey, there is not a single voice in anybody who matters in Turkey that ever thought we should leave NATO. That only happens in op-eds coming out of DC. Turkey and NATO alike, should we kick them out? So you can't. But even within NATO, and for those of us before Russia invaded Ukraine again in 2022, for those of us who've been really concerned about security and stability in Northern Europe and Russia, we always said, do you even know what you're writing about? You can't have a NATO defense with Turkey outside of it. Yes, it is difficult. Yes, we need to find a compromise. We need to keep working at this. So it wasn't just Turkey's failure in certain moments. In Libya, for example, France was backing Haftar, who was backed by Wagner. Turkey was actually saving the NATO engaged, UK, US engaged government in Tripoli, but the opinion editorials were like, Turkey's betraying the West in Libya and France is defending. What is going on here, guys? Let's decide who's turning away from the West. France was turning away from the West at that moment, etc. So some of these relationships are diehard realism that underwrites. And that's why engagement with Shanghai Cooperation, again, geography kicks in. That's not as important. Like NATO is a military alliance. EU is a huge economic anchor for Turkey. That is diplomatically meaningful as a message, might bring some potential, but there are also other bodies that can join, and it will never compensate. So that's why I think no matter what President Erdogan has said, there is underlying sadness that Turkish-US relations are at a historic low. I genuinely think there is a genuine hurt that actually you get that actually US and Turkey should be better allies. And we've been, unfairly treated, and actually things should have kind of worked differently. Yes, we might have done some mistakes. And that to me, again, goes to show that no matter how you see the strategic independence push, which is understandable, there is still an anchoring towards the West that will never leave. And so what does the West do with that? That to me is the biggest question. There is no, again, like Biden era policies has done better in not letting things break down further, but it hasn't necessarily gone way more. In Ukraine, we were going actually quite positive at one stage. And then now we had 7 October attack, and what's happening in Gaza, it's a bit unclear. But Ukraine was actually helping to repair some of these things for Turkey. And again, so when it comes to migration, climate change, and all the other topics, you see particularly European nations' portfolios happy to work, compartmentalize, enter into deals. But that's not a sustainable model. Like that's, the lowest common denominator when you have a neighborhood country with all these questions is really not a sustainable policy. It's good to contain a crisis. But at one stage, somebody in Europe has to say, guys, I think this is the time. We need to look 10, 20, 30 years ahead and say, what do we want to see and actually work towards it? And I am just shocked how little there is strategy in town.
Thank you so much for that. I think we share some of the frustrations at the op-eds that are written when, one particular thing happens and all of a sudden it's a turn, it's a this or that. My biggest pet peeve was, Turkey's reviving the EU process right now. Oh, after the elections, Turkey's taking a pro-Western turn. It's a new era. No, it's not. It's rhetoric aimed for a different audience, not for you. Don't buy it. So thank you for answering actually a bunch of questions that Marian posed. And Marian, you very strategically and effectively asked one of the questions that Aaron was going to ask as well about Turkey's EU membership having died a long time ago. So we've already got a couple of questions answered. Let's see if we've got some questions from the in-house audience. So go ahead and raise your hand. Please do wait for the microphone so that the online community can hear you. Introduce yourself and ask your question. We'll take a couple at a time.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for coming and giving that wonderful summary of Turkish relations. My name is Max. I'm a first year MAIR student.
I'm very sorry for your chosen path. Anyway.
No, I'm very, very happy actually. But my question is about the normalization of relations with Armenia. You mentioned the Crossroads of Peace initiative by Nikol Pashinyan. And I was wondering how you feel that, since the topic of the conversation is the last 100 years, legacies, the Armenian genocide, which, the Turkish state continues to, deny, so to speak. Do you see a pathway forward for normalizations? What kind of preconditions will that look like? Would that be affected by their quote unquote brotherly relationships with Azerbaijan? I would like to hear your thoughts.
No, thank you so much. No, look, it's a real question, and it's a very difficult one and very easy one at the same time. If you remember, Abdullah Gül went to Yerevan, watched football game together. The border in Kars was literally being cleaned and painted. Turkish Airlines was about to fly direct from Istanbul to Yerevan. Erdogan used the Armenian word for great catastrophe to express his sympathies on 25th of April, the first time he ever commented on it. And you had commemorations happening in Turkey, and there were a few moments where I had tears in my eyes, right? Somebody who really over the years, really bled for those legacies, bled in my heart and for the pain the people carry. Because, you can't, I've done research everywhere in the Middle East, in Iran, in Lebanon, in Armenia. I've been to Karabakh, many years ago. So, and everywhere I went, because I have a Turkish name and I sound funny in my language, I ended up having to sit down with so many people in a very beautiful way and hearing their family stories, their legacies, So I always bled in my heart for this moment that actually the pain that history carries might never fully disappear. Justice is a very difficult concept, but acknowledgement might go a long way. But what acknowledgement means in today's term is never really satisfactory for anybody. And it's never complete, but at least it opens us a space for a new conversation, maybe a new shared future to emerge. And one of my cunning ways of doing that was backing away from state-to-state statement dynamics, but looking at more social stuff. Like at one stage, I was collecting the stories of Turks who lost their lives while they were saving Armenian neighbors. Because to this day, there's no mention of righteous Gentiles. Remember in Yad Vashem and a lot of Holocaust memorials, there's a section dedicated to non-Jews who saved Jews. There is hardly any site anywhere dedicated to Turks who died in saving their Armenian neighbors. And I thought, wow, maybe that shared humanity, that actually story could be fragmented. Evil Turk versus the victim could actually be like what we do with any other mass atrocity and war, and truth gets more fragmented and we mourn together. We promise never again together. We imagine a better future together. And I think that failed. That era is gone for so many reasons. That really is my personal sadness. Geopolitically, at the same time, I think Pashinyan has been really surprising. The fact that he was there when President Erdogan was being sworn in, I thought it was a stroke of genius, and it was politically very risky for him. And I do think with that single step and few other things, he has actually already opened the door for the fact that Armenia is actually has never been a threat to Turkey. And the issues of Armenia are not really a major issue for Ankara in any shape or form. But you're right, Azerbaijan mattered for energy, for relationships, and it was Azerbaijan that put an end to Turkish-Armenian easing with Gülera and football diplomacy and everything. But now that the Karabakh question, for Azerbaijan at least, it's stabilizing, maybe Ankara could actually say, now it's also time to actually move on these things, right? And that might actually give us that. I do think there might be a wild breakthrough ahead of us. When it comes to history, memory, identity is a huge open-ended process that I do think the political statements are the last steps, not the first. So I do think our expectation has been a bit wrong about how to go about that. If you really want that trajectory being changed, I think first the Turkish public needs to understand the depth of the suffering of Armenians before a Turkish president can ever say, sorry.
And I think there's so many elements to that in terms of the Turkish public needing to understand what that means in the education system, what that means in the media, what that means in terms of some of the stereotypes and the narratives that continue to be promulgated, and how there is a domestic politics kind of rally around the flag effect that can be had by politicizing these issues. But I really appreciate the note that early in the AKP's years, there was this push to normalize relations, part of, zero problems with neighbors, to pave the way for strategic depth with Cyprus, with Armenia, and that there were arduous efforts put into that. And then, Azerbaijan pushes back, or there's an election in Cyprus. And so then you have these kind of complicating factors to some of these approaches. But yeah, I think that focusing on memory and identity and the constraining power of that is really important. And changing narratives in nation building institutions like the military, the education system, and the media, I think is really a big part of that. Next question from the audience. Who do we have?
Yeah, good evening. Thank you very much. So many points to reflect on, really. My name is Ricardo. I'm a candidate here in Bologna at the University of Bologna, like a few hundred meters away from here. And would like to bring it down to the domestic politics a bit, because it is today's news that the E Party and Meral Actionnaire decided not to join the JP Alliance for the upcoming local elections. And therefore, they will basically field candidates against the candidates that they supported in the 2019 local elections, which is, something very strange, but kind of sort of normal in Turkish politics, I would say. If on the one hand, it's very hard for the opposition to sort of win the elections or even participate in the political space and the political debate, on the other hand, it seems to me that the opposition is doing everything they can to help Erdogan to keep the power. How do you make sense of that in today's Turkey?
Do we have a bottle of wine on the table? No, look, Ricardo, I think you know the country clearly very well. Before the presidential election, I think there were a few moments where I was very bitterly skeptical of any possibility of the opposition forming a bloc because of no other unifying thing except toppling Erdogan, which isn't really enough. And because of all these divergences within them, personalities among them, the party structures, their weaknesses, lack of mobilization, lack of a clear candidate that far in the game, lack of a clear electoral campaign. And one of the things which AKP has done phenomenally well over the years is to run a mega campaign machine that ran all the time. Like they didn't turn it off, right? It runs all the time, their party structure, their reach. And that's actually more than anything else, that has been the key cornerstone of all the successes that they enjoyed. So I was very skeptical, and then closer to election, I thought, oh, wow, maybe, this is one of these wild moments, maybe something will happen. And then the night of the elections, for me, the opposition crumbled. By day 3 after the first round, I was like, this is the end, my friend. So now further fragmentation isn't surprising at all. And electorally, I mean, a few of the forecasts and the reports that I read, it might not have as major of an impact as we think now. I mean, local elections have a lot of value and meaning, but I think where things are now for the next 5 years with this election outcome, presidential system, and a new constitution possibly on the table, this might not be an earth-shattering political moment in breaking that trajectory, if you like, either way. And we'll see where CHP will go next. I think that's a really important question. Will they break the shell? Kılıçdaroğlu was one big disappointment after another. Just finally, we thought, maybe not, hold on. And turned out, oh gosh, what if he actually won? You know, like I had few people actually confess this, and they said, what if he actually won? Like these are diehard CHP voters that really stopped. And let's see what happens with CHP. I mean, would it change, evolve? Do you remember when AKP emerged out of failed Islamism in Turkey with a new kind of synergy of religion, identity, conservatism, neoliberal economy? Will there be a new kind of Kemalism emerge on the crumble of CHP? EU party isn't that, and other nationalists are not that. They are still the same message, fragmenting. And that's good news for Erdogan. But the bad news for Erdogan is he also cannot count on the same number of votes that he did personally, and his party has lost so much too. So that's why maybe you could say, maybe it's not that bad that you're having so many parties fragmenting, because then alliances actually leads to compromise. So that's why I think Erdogan isn't too happy with MHP alliance, because, you know, Bahçeli does have a lot of nagging. And if that alliance then includes another one and another one, another one, that's only going to mean more compromise. And that might not be a bad thing. Maybe that's what we're rooting for here, which is more fragmentation, please, so that, you know, power is always negotiated, and that hopefully gives more chances of influence, and excesses are being kind of stopped. But I think the new constitution process ahead is probably a lot more important to observe than the next local elections. But that might be because of my fatigue towards elections at the moment.
Yeah, I think the point about sort of the symbolic meaning of local elections is really important, as opposed to what it actually means for national level outcomes. And I think the loss of Ankara and Istanbul would be pretty devastating for the opposition, since they really counted on that as a foothold towards national politics. But then you sort of see the fragmentation that happened. I want to give Marian a turn for one last question, if you would like, and then we'll collect a few from the audience to round it out. So, Marian?
A quick question. You mentioned this neo-Ottomanism before. We were talking about this neo-Ottoman cool in our class, and I was wondering, what is your stance on how does that influence what it means to be Turkish, what Turkish identity?
So yeah, so I am, you might have picked up from my tone of voice, but I'm a bit skeptical. So I think neo-Ottoman, I think what it tries to capture, if that word is used to capture an attempt to synthesize the Ottoman legacy with kind of economic development, we saw social changes, a kind of post-Republican identity, that I could go with it, because you've seen a lot of cultural elements that brought back Ottoman clothes, even architecture, even, you know, like even Paşabahçe creations, glass. So if we are talking about that from a perspective of a new synthesis of Turkey rediscovering Ottoman heritage and using it as an appeal and identity in culture production, in domestic politics, I could see that. If it comes to a foreign policy orientation, I think it's bananas to argue. I don't think it has driven Turkish foreign policy as a coherent framework. I don't think it has any buy-in anywhere in the region. I mean, like, if you are the former colonial power, and it's interesting, we never talk about Turkey from a vocabulary of post-colonialism, because Turkey is a post-colonial power, right? So there is actually no decolonization discussion that we need to have on Turkey, because Turkey is a post-colonial power, and it's got a colonial legacy. It really ruled that land. It's not by giving roses and Turkish delights. I mean, it ruled that land by sword. So anyway, I never read AKP foreign policy as that at all. I read it as an emerging middle power wanting to maximize economic relations, have I say again, because of the global geopolitical context, same as how Saudi Arabia has changed, and even how Qatar, even other countries and even Russia, even China, you could say it's a similar kind of trajectory. So that's how I always read it. Like, I haven't seen an ideological thread that ties in the very complex Turkish foreign policy behavior for the last 20 years, from outreach in Africa. That has nothing to do with Ottomans. Sub-Saharan Africa wasn't really an Ottoman land as such. Reach to east, again, you mentioned Shanghai, that's too far east. And even NATO, importance of NATO still to this day. I just think as a foreign policy analysis framework, I think it's a gimmick. It was a great op-ed gimmick and it sells. So like we already hinted on, like, you need someone who's catchy things. If you say it's complicated, nobody will publish that. But if you say it's neo-Ottomans or it's Turkey, and NATO, like, turning away from the West, that sells. And I don't think those capture. But domestic culture, by all means, I've seen, I can't find, I haven't managed to find the right word to capture it. But at one stage, I was thinking a lot about late modernity, like works of Zygmunt Bauman and others, not post-modernity, but late modernity, and how Turkish transition from a strong modern nation state within an economic boom was actually bringing back this cultural anchor search and synthesis of the old glorious days within a context of fast-changing Turkey, mega architectural boom, and even the architectural expressions of that era, like some of the buildings, how they're trying to blend in with cultural patterns. And I actually read that as late modernity, like as in post-modernity, but I use that word. And there are examples of it in so many other places as well, as a search for this, if you like, anchor in a country that was going a mega economic boom, social transformation. But then you also seen the comeback of nationalism in Turkey, just like in Europe, just like in North America. We've seen people, talking about how postmodernism is dead now. We're back to the nation state. The borders are back. Make America great again. Make Italy strong again. To take Turkey, UK out of EU. So you could see how those insular nationalist and anchor points of our story has also showed itself in Turkey too, which is another fascinating global turn that we went from as a result of this global context. And so that's why I think neo-Ottomanism, if it was used to tease out some of these anchorage points culturally, it was helpful. But otherwise, it was a representation where you were saying, oh, these are, what is the revisionist power, and who's got this ideology. And like we've done that with Iran for decades. Oh, they're just mad millennial mullahs who will just bomb the whole Middle East at any given day. All we need is Netanyahu to show 10 more slides in UN General Assembly. That ideological kind of reading of the other is very dangerous, because it leaves no chance for us to genuinely understand what drives them. Then therefore, how can we analyze and forecast and respond? And if it becomes that, if you then see, in Iran, a regime that is just apocalyptic, that like Ahmadinejad era kind of reading of Iran, then of course you have no other option but to go bomb everything, versus an actor that you can decode, understand, and find ways to, same as with Turkey. If you caricaturize it from a perspective of they're driven by this neo-Ottoman revisionism, oh, you have no space for any negotiation, compromise, understanding, solutions. This is all about this ideology. I find it very sinister, as a very sinister way of representing for a political agenda. And often people who use that had a political agenda, one way or another.
All right. If it's okay, we're going to take just a couple of questions, and then you can decide how you would like to address them. So, okay.
Fine.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Let's try to take each one. Be very quick if you can. Yes, please.
I'll write it down so otherwise
Yes.
it's too late.
Hi, my name is Jonathan. Thank you so much for all that you've been talking about before. I was wondering, following up like on the middle power discourse, like last G20, there was Erdogan like talking about this IMEC, like the India Middle East trade route, and how he was opposing it with like pledging billions to Iraq, etc. how should we see this? Is this part of like also middle power competition? And what role does Turkey play in
Sure.
this competition?
Thank you.
Back to Diana, Jacob.
Well, I wanted to hear more about brain drain and why you're not worried about it.
Okay, nice and concise there. Very good, Jacob.
I love it. It's like boom.
Mine kind of builds off of what you were just talking about with neo-Ottomanism. I'm wondering, you gave like an optimistic conclusion at the end, which I appreciate, but I'm wondering how you think that the current sort of national identity campaign related to neo-Ottomanism, related to family values, to moral impetus, how much you think that might stain the country and society going forward, especially in relation to those who have been othered, whether Kurds or anybody who fits outside of that.
My name is Ziya, and I'm a first-year master's student of international relations at the University of Bologna. Thank you for the excellent speech and excellent questions and answers. We've talked about West and the EU and the relations between them and Turkey, and we see in Germany and major Western powers, like major EU powers like Germany and France, and the statements between those countries and Turkey, and the structural problems in the relationship, and obviously the US and Turkey. But there seems to be one odd man out, and that is the United Kingdom. We don't really see that kind of dynamic and attitude between those two countries. And then my question is, how do you view the UK-Turkish relationship as and the impact of Brexit, as now the UK and Turkey have become two countries on the edge of the EU with love-hate relationship with the EU, and can we really talk of a UK-Turkey alliance in that context? Thank you.
And I'm going to add, oh, okay, one more. Yep.
Hello, thanks for the information. My name is John, and I'm also a student in University of Bologna. I'm studying international relations master's degree. It's my first year. So my question is also about Turkish identity, national identity. Nowadays, there are arguments about the word Türk and Türkiye'li. Some parts of the country is rejecting the idea of how happy whom says I'm Turkish, ne mutlu Türk'üm diyene. So, and basically they reject the ethnical definition. And what should be the proper approach and solution about this identity crisis in terms of IR? Is this issue can cause problems about foreign affairs, because there are a certain support for Kurdistan and independence of Kurds from Europe and US. And as we all know, internal problems are shaping the foreign policies. So I'm curious about your opinions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And I'm actually going to add one more,
Great,
which is,
bring
I
it
know,
on.
and then you're going to have like 3 minutes to take any of them that you like, because that's how we do things here. And then you earn your supper. So Eduardo online, who is part of my class, wants to know in terms of the changes to the judiciary. We talked about the changing role of the civil military, but changes in the judiciary. We're seeing this sort of constitutional crisis right now. With the appeals court pushing back against the constitutional court. Do you think that these crises right now have any kind of impact on the ability of governance in Turkey to be constrained, or do you think that's going to have long-term impacts essentially? So any of those that you'd like.
Wow,
for it.
guys, brilliant. So look, brain drain. Let's get that out of our system. So I think there are multiple layers of it. So whenever somebody leaves any country out of I have to leave, I have no future because of social, political, cultural, or personal preference, or gender, or issues, it's horribly sad, right? Yes, you're not a refugee, you're not an asylum seeker, but you're literally leaving because you don't see a personal future. So that element of it is soul crushing, right? That's very true, right? The other element of it is, I don't know how to phrase it. So in Turkey, for example, I was a really bad student, like genuinely. I failed in a lot of my classes. Nobody thought I would even go to university, right? Genuinely, I was always a bad student, barely passed any text. I was always like the lowest of my friends, grades-wise. Today, I have a PhD from Cambridge on Law Economics. I have 2 master's degrees, blah, blah, blah. And it all came out in the British education system because it was very different. It was about me researching, me learning, me exploring. The Turkish education system really led me to do none of them, right? And I was really bad at memorizing, passing exams. And so I look back at maybe it's because of my own journey where I studied in Asia, I lived in UK, I lived in other places, blah, blah, blah. And maybe I've seen myself grow and large, and I've seen so many of my also friends connecting, having new networks, new information, new debates which they didn't really know about till they left, new politics which they didn't know about till they left. So when they think about Turkey, when they engage with Turkey, when they enable projects in Turkey, they're very different. I got a family member who's investing in a very large project that enables 500 women in Turkey to do something phenomenally different. She would have never been able to do that if she hadn't gone to US and became a very successful businesswoman. So there's an element within this globalized world that I do think somebody who lives those things that evolve don't just got cut off for good, like you're sailing into the sunset, off you go. Also, I think even if you look back at emergence of AKP era, there were a lot of these religiously conservative Turks that left Turkey as well in 70s and 80s and 90s, and they came back to Turkey with AKP era in a very highly educated and new vision. In fact, it enabled a lot of AKP as well too. So a part of me looks at it from a larger pattern to say, is it actually a bad thing in today's globalized world people move? No, I'm quite a big believer in migration as a net good overall for the world. Being an asylum seeker, being a refugee is heartbreakingly difficult. That's a very severe cutoff. But I do think in the long run, these links in Turkey are not disappearing. Like the medical doctors who leave Turkey is a net damage to Turkey. Those kind of crucial industries that are living in bulk is a net damage to Turkey. There's no other way of looking at it. But I think overall, the picture isn't that clear, as in Turkey has no more resource or human resource, or Turkey has no more anything left and all the educated ones have left. It's not like that. There's still also a lot of people who choose to be there and want to be there, don't want to leave. That's why I thought actually that brain drain, I don't think it captures the complexity of today's globalized economy and opportunities and political impact, social engagement. So I do also think exposure globally is really good. Like I genuinely wish like CHP as a party could be sent abroad for 20 years and then come back with a new secular vision. Genuinely, maybe that's me being tongue-in-cheek, but that's why I take it as a complex picture. Certain aspects of it are bad. Some things are actually good. Some things are actually maybe time. Time will have a bigger impact on Turkey than I think we think, in a good way. That's why all my comments about the positive long-term future isn't really about next 1, 2, 3 years. I'm looking at 10, 20, 30 years, because even if you look back at the last 100 years, Turkey 2.0 looks suspiciously like Turkey 1.0, right? There's one type of a Turk, homogenized push, one type of kosher citizen, one type of kosher public space, parties that are allowed or not, identities that are allowed or not. But even the Kemalist project have failed to die out the religious conservative voice in Turkey and to mute out the Kurdish nationalist identity in Turkey. After everything, they're still there, like they won. And to this day, I am yet to see a study that can really convince me that Turks are becoming more religious, more conservative than they were 20 years ago. They're not, right? So socially, religiosity, religious expression is a bit complex issue, but I don't see that change. And if you remember in the postmodern coup in 1998, one of the generals said something really interesting. He said, this new rule shall last 1,000 years. Right? I don't even remember that general's name, right? So because of what they've done in 1998 and ousted, caused the collapse of Erbakan government, we had AKP eventually and everything came back as a inertia. So think about it. I don't think this is sustainable. I just don't think President Erdogan, particularly at this stage in his rule, unlike maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago, has that much political and social and cultural capital to shape a nation in his own image. It's just not possible. This is a very complex society. Even religiosity and voters and Islamism is so complex. I do think ultimately those macro projects fail. So that's why it kind of gives me hope that actually in 10 years, in 15 years, you might see, hopefully, the positive view would be there'll be more democratic maturation in post-Erdogan era. Negative view might be that actually, there will be more contention. But the global connections Turkey has, transportation, education, trade. There's a limit to how far this nation can be carved easily. That's the point I was trying to make about. Ultimately, I think just like Kemalism has failed as a mega project, but still took Turkey, I think Erdogan's vision of pious generations is shaping Turkey, but it's not going to create this brand new religious nation as some people I think. I think it is actually going to be again a backlash and maybe reconfiguration, maybe a new year ahead of us where we could envision those values together. Maybe I'm naive.
So I think you actually answered a number of questions in that answer, in terms of kind of the identity, the ways in which these homogenizing projects don't end up rooting out those minorities. And in fact, they then kind of start their own cycle of pushing back. And if we do try to make the supper that you have so well earned, we have to call it a day now, we have to call it a night. But I think, in fact, again, in your last answer, you've answered quite a lot of the points that were raised. So I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you so much for showing up. Thank you for your fantastic questions, both online and in person. Please do follow Professor Meral's fantastic work that he's doing, whether it's on defense, security, identity, religion, conflict. As I say, when you study
And
Turkey,
baking künefe or baklava as well.
Künefe or baklava. I do the etsiz çiğ köfte, baklava, anlaştık. Harika. Thank you so much for coming, and please join me in thanking Professor Meral for this fantastic talk. And thank you, Marian, for excellent questions.
Thank you so much. Great. Well, we covered a lot of